Night lifted slowly from the mountains, peeling away like a thin layer of smoke as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon. Its touch was gentle at first, brushing the jagged ridges with a pale silver that made the world feel as if it were waking reluctantly, stretching itself from long-held stillness. The valley below shifted in color as the light grew stronger, turning shades of deep charcoal into soft golds and muted ambers. The air carried a coolness that felt untouched by breath or motion, as though the land had been holding itself still through the night, waiting for something to acknowledge its quiet. In that rising glow, the ground felt ancient, older than memory, older than the struggles that once shook its soil, yet open, receptive to anyone willing to listen. A gentle wind traveled through the tall grasses, bending each blade with the slow patience of a hand passing over them. It moved with intention, almost as if whispering directions only the attentive could follow. Sun Tzu's presence felt woven into that wind. Not as a figure standing in the light, but as an atmosphere. A steady awareness rising with the morning, settling into the valley, guiding the listener into a deeper way of seeing. His teachings did not appear as commands but as quiet impressions forming between breaths, as though the world itself had absorbed them. The listener stepped onto the valley floor, the soil soft beneath their feet, carrying remnants of countless footsteps long vanished. Some paths had been carved deeply by the weight of those who crossed with urgency. Others were faint, almost erased, as if the ones who walked them moved lightly, trusting the land to remember without needing to leave a heavy mark. These paths intersected and diverged in subtle lines that mirrored the quiet complexity of human choices. Sun Tzu had always emphasized that every decision, no matter how small, left a trace. And the valley displayed these traces like a map of past intentions waiting to be read. The early light revealed a scattering of broken twigs, thin cracks in stones, and depressions in the earth where someone once paused, shifted their weight, or changed direction abruptly. Each mark suggested a story, an uncertainty, a hesitation, a sudden idea. The listener felt a pull toward these subtle details, sensing the quiet guidance hidden inside them. Sun Tzu believed that the world spoke constantly through such signs. People simply forgot how to look. The listener crouched briefly, touching one of the depressions with their fingertips, feeling the lingering imprint of a decision made in haste. The earth, still cool from the night, held the story gently as though protecting the choices of those who had passed before. A faint sound drifted across the valley, the distant call of a lone bird perched somewhere in the rising light. Its cry echoed once, sharp but not urgent, before fading into the soft hum of the awakening landscape. The listener followed its direction with their eyes and saw a small ridge where the first rays of sun illuminated a cluster of stones. The stones seemed arranged naturally, but their angles formed a pattern that hinted at deliberate placement. Sun Tzu's voice rose subtly within the listener's awareness, reminding them that structure can emerge even in places where none was intended. People often sought purpose in grand gestures, forgetting that truth hid in the alignment of simple things. The angle of a stone, the direction of a breeze, the stillness between moments. The listener began walking toward the ridge, each step slow, unforced. The wind shifted again, this time carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant pine. That subtle aroma softened the inward tightness the listener hadn't realized they were holding. Sun Tzu's guidance often worked that way, quietly loosening what had been clenched, revealing what lay beneath tension. The listener felt their senses sharpen, not with urgency but with a grounded calm. As the sun climbed higher, its warmth spread across their shoulders, blending with the breeze in a gentle contrast that felt like an invitation to remain aware of opposing forces without resisting either. At the edge of the ridge, the ground rose into a narrow ledge overlooking a deeper section of the valley. From this higher vantage, the landscape stretched with quiet elegance, groves of ancient trees scattered across gentle slopes, shadows cast by shifting morning clouds drifting over the earth like slow-moving thoughts. The listener paused there, absorbing the sight, feeling the subtle shift in perspective. Sun Tzu taught that clarity often arrived not by forcing insight but by standing in the right place long enough for the world to reveal itself. And here the ridge felt like such a place. Below, a thin mist hovered above a small stream that wound through the valley, catching light in shimmering outlines that moved like liquid silver. The water flowed with a quiet purpose, shaping its path through the land not by force but by persistent adaptability. Sun Tzu's teachings rose again. Water takes the shape of whatever holds it, not because it is weak, but because it understands movement more deeply than resistance ever could. The listener watched the stream curve around stones, glide over shallow dips and settle into deeper pools, its rhythm steady, patient, wholly unbothered by obstacles. A sudden breeze swept across the ridge, cool and refreshing, tugging gently at the listener's clothing. It carried with it a new stillness, a moment where the world seemed to pause, waiting. The listener felt a subtle shift inside themselves, as if the journey ahead had just begun to take shape. This was not a moment of revelation, but the first breath of a deeper understanding unfolding, quiet and steady, like the way morning light expands across the land without announcing its arrival. And in that expanding light, the listener sensed something forming beyond the ridge, something subtle, quiet, but undeniably present. The valley seemed to lean forward with it, as if guiding them toward the next movement waiting to be discovered in the slow, unfolding rhythm of the day. The ridge held its quiet breath as the listener descended toward the stream, the earth beneath their feet shifting from firm stone to softer soil warmed by the rising sun. Each step carried a subtle weight, the kind of grounded presence that emerges when the mind begins to settle into deeper awareness. The valley no longer felt like a place to be observed. It felt like a presence itself, an attentive companion that responded to every shift in posture, every quiet moment of realization. Sun Tzu's guidance moved through that atmosphere like an unseen thread, connecting the listener to the land with a steady, unbroken calm. As they approached the stream, its murmur grew clearer, a soft, deliberate rhythm shaped by centuries of flowing across stone. The closer they came, the more distinct the water's voice became, revealing layers of movement hidden beneath the surface. There were swift currents brushing against the rocks, slower eddies circling calmly in shaded pools, and faint trickles threading through patches of reeds. Each sound blended into a single whispering harmony that felt both ancient and continually renewed. The listener paused at the edge of the water, allowing its presence to settle into their mind like a slow, deep inhale. The surface of the stream reflected the sky in fragmented pieces, shimmering blues, pale gold streaks, drifting cloud shapes warped by the rippling flow. When the listener reached down to touch the water, its coolness spread across their fingertips, grounding them in the immediacy of the moment. Sun Tzu's presence deepened here, as though his teachings existed not just in words but in the movement of the water itself. He often compared strategy to fluidity, the ability to shape oneself to circumstance, to yield without breaking, to move forward without needing to force every outcome. The water held that truth effortlessly. The listener followed the stream's path as it wound through a narrow curve, where the surrounding trees grew thicker and the sunlight filtered through their branches in shifting, dappled patterns. The air grew richer with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the soft chorus of small insects rose and fell like a distant chant. As they walked, the listener noticed marks along the stream's banks, footprints softened by recent moisture, a broken patch of reeds where something passed with speed, faint claw marks on a fallen log. These traces hinted at life hidden within the valley's stillness, each mark a quiet testament to movement that occurred before their arrival. The listener crouched near the broken reeds, examining the subtle bend in their fibers. The force required to break them had not been aggressive, it had been quick, purposeful. Sun Tzu would have noted such distinctions immediately. He taught that understanding movement, human or otherwise, began with reading intention. A hurried step speaks differently from a fearful one. A broken branch reveals more than a path, it reveals the mindset of the one who moved through. The listener allowed this realization to rise without rushing toward interpretation, letting the environment offer its truths in its own time. A soft crackle from deeper within the trees drew their attention. A small animal, a hare or perhaps a fox, broke through the underbrush before pausing at the edge of the stream. Its body remained tense but not panicked, its ears flicking toward the listener before it lowered its head to drink. Each movement carried the measured energy of a creature accustomed to balancing caution with necessity. The listener watched it quietly, understanding why Sun Tzu often referenced animals. Their survival depended on reading reality without illusion. They wasted no energy on assumptions, no effort on wishful thinking. They lived entirely in alignment with the moment. When the animal finished drinking, it darted into the trees with a sudden burst of motion that lifted leaves into the air. The forest absorbed the movement seamlessly, returning almost instantly to its steady hush. The listener remained still for a few breaths, letting the moment imprint itself. The figure from Sun Tzu's teachings would have said that even brief encounters carry meaning, not through their drama, but through the quiet truths they reveal. Clarity often emerges in the spaces between actions, not in the actions themselves. The path ahead followed the stream toward a cluster of ancient cedars whose trunks rose thick and straight, their bark darkened by time and weather. These trees formed a natural corridor, their branches intertwining overhead in a protective arch that filtered the sunlight into a muted, atmospheric glow. Entering this corridor felt like stepping into a sanctuary shaped by the world rather than by human hands. The sound of the stream deepened beneath the canopy, its rhythm echoing softly off the surrounding wood. The listener walked between the cedars, feeling the air cool around them as shadows lengthened. Here the forest seemed to listen. Every footstep felt amplified in the hush, every breath carried further before dissolving into the stillness. Sun Tzu often spoke of such places, quiet sanctuaries where the noise of the world fell away, allowing truth to rise without distortion. The listener felt something within themselves steadying, as though the calm of the corridor seeped into their bones. Halfway through the grove, a small clearing opened on the left, illuminated by a single shaft of sun that pierced the canopy like a focused beam. Within this clearing stood a stone, smooth, rounded, and worn by time. Someone long ago had carved faint lines into its surface, though age had softened their edges. The markings didn't form clear symbols. They looked more like an attempt to capture a moment of understanding. The listener approached it and placed a hand gently on the stone. It felt cool, solid, grounding. Sun Tzu believed that knowledge left behind by others was never fully lost. It simply waited for someone whose mind was prepared to receive it. The carvings were not instructions, they were reminders. Reminders that clarity was not inherited but discovered. That understanding was not a fixed achievement, but a continual unfolding. And that every path, no matter how ancient, offered something to those who walked it with attention. As the listener stepped back from the stone, a gentle breeze moved through the clearing, stirring leaves into a slow spiral. The movement felt deliberate, almost guiding. The corridor ahead seemed to brighten slightly as the breeze passed, as though urging them forward. The listener followed the subtle invitation, aware that the day was shifting, that the valley was leading them toward a deeper encounter waiting somewhere beyond the next bend. The cedar corridor opened into a wide meadow where the morning light spread freely across the land, illuminating tall grasses and clusters of wildflowers swaying in the soft wind. Their colors, soft yellows, muted purples, delicate whites, created a gentle quilt across the earth. The sky stretched above in a calm, clear expanse, carrying a faint gradient of blue that deepened toward the horizon. The air here felt lighter, infused with warmth and the faint sweetness of blooming petals. The shift from the cool, shaded grove into this open brightness felt like stepping from introspection into possibility. The listener paused at the edge of the meadow, taking in the openness. Sun Tzu often described moments like this as transitions, the emotional equivalent of emerging from shadow into a wider field of understanding. The world looked different from here not because it had changed but because the listener had. Their senses felt sharpened, their awareness more grounded. Each rustle in the grass, each shift in the wind carried a distinct presence that felt newly noticeable. A subtle motion caught their eye, a figure far across the meadow, barely visible at first. Their form moved with deliberate ease, as though familiar with the terrain. The figure's posture was upright but relaxed, their movements steady, unhurried. Something about them suggested intention rather than coincidence, as though their presence in the meadow was not casual but rooted in the same quiet purpose that guided Sun Tzu's teachings. The listener felt no fear, only curiosity and a growing sense that this distant figure held meaning in the unfolding path. They began walking toward the center of the meadow, the grass brushing gently against their legs, shifting in waves beneath the morning breeze. The figure in the distance adjusted their path slightly, not approaching directly but aligning their movement in a way that brought their trajectories closer. Sun Tzu taught that some encounters are neither forced nor avoided. They arise naturally when two paths shaped by intention draw near. The listener sensed this truth in the figure's subtle adjustment. Birdsong drifted across the meadow, rising in soft patterns that echoed the quiet harmony of the landscape. Each melody seemed to complement the next, as though the birds moved under a shared understanding of the morning's rhythm. Sun Tzu believed that harmony mattered as much as strength. Forces aligned with the world's natural flow multiplied their power. Forces that clashed with it found themselves exhausted quickly. The listener felt this principle in the meadow's gentle choreography. Near the meadow's center, a cluster of stones formed a rough circle, their surfaces warmed by the sunlight. Some were small and smooth, others bore jagged edges as though fractured recently. The listener approached them and noticed faint traces of ash between the stones, evidence of a fire long extinguished. Whoever once gathered here had left no footprints or tools, only the quiet residue of warmth that had burned, then faded. Sun Tzu taught that the absence of noise often spoke more loudly than its presence. The lack of clutter suggested discipline. The minimal trace suggested intention without waste. The distant figure had drawn closer now, their steps steady, their presence quiet but unmistakably aware of the listener. There was no sense of confrontation, only a quiet acknowledgement, like two travelers recognizing in each other a shared purpose. The listener felt a subtle shift in the air as the figure's approach became more defined, the meadow absorbing the energy of the encounter. A breeze swept across the meadow, carrying with it a faint rustling sound that spread in a gentle wave. The grasses leaned collectively in one direction, revealing for a moment the underlying contours of the land, slight dips and rises that shaped the meadow's natural flow. Sun Tzu emphasized the importance of reading terrain not only for advantage but for understanding. The shape of the land mirrors the shape of situations. The listener watched the grasses bend and rise again, noting how they revealed the hidden structure beneath. The figure continued approaching until they were close enough for their features to take shape in the shifting light. Their expression was calm, observant, carrying a depth that suggested they moved through the world with deliberate attention. They paused at a respectful distance, allowing the space between them to hold its own meaning. That pause felt significant, as though the figure recognized the listener's readiness for the next layer of understanding. The wind quieted. The meadow stilled. Time seemed to lean inward. The figure raised their gaze, meeting the listener's eyes with a steady presence that carried no judgment, only recognition. And in that quiet exchange, the listener felt the world shift in a subtle but undeniable way, as though the journey was no longer about walking through the valley, but about stepping into a deeper truth rising gently to meet them. The meadow quieted around them as the figure's presence settled into the air like a slow-forming echo. Their expression carried a calm that did not seek to impress or intimidate, but simply existed with a quiet, unwavering certainty. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind stilled, the grasses paused in place, and the birds' songs softened into faint, distant notes. The listener felt as though the world were offering them a moment of stillness, an open door into a deeper sense of perception that Sun Tzu often described but never forced. Understanding, he believed, arrived in silence when one became willing to hear. The figure stepped closer with a quiet, measured stride. Each footfall pressed gently into the earth, leaving faint impressions that seemed to align naturally with the contours of the meadow. When they reached a comfortable distance, they inclined their heads slightly, an acknowledgement not of hierarchy but of awareness. Their voice, when it finally rose, carried the grounded softness of someone who had spent long years observing the world with patience. They asked the listener what they sought in these fields: knowledge, clarity, purpose, or simply a place to breathe. The listener answered not with grand declarations but with quiet honesty. They sought understanding, of conflict, of movement, of the world's hidden forces, and of themselves within those forces. The figure listened with full attention, the kind that made each word feel gently held rather than judged. When the listener finished, the figure nodded as though confirming something already sensed. They gestured for the listener to walk with them, moving deeper into the meadow where the grasses grew taller and the flowers gathered in more concentrated clusters. As they walked, the sunlight shifted across the land in warm waves, illuminating patches of soil and stones with varying intensity. The figure spoke softly as they moved, describing how Sun Tzu believed that clarity was not something found at the end of a journey but discovered gradually through attention. The world did not hide truth out of cruelty, it simply tested the sincerity of one's gaze. Their path led them toward a series of gently rolling hills that curved like soft breaths beneath the sky. Each rise revealed new variations of the meadow, areas where the grass flattened from recent passage, patches of disturbed soil where animals had foraged, places where the wind shaped the vegetation into subtle, repeating patterns. The figure paused at one of these patterns, crouching to run a hand over the grass. The blades bent in a direction that contradicted the natural wind. Something had passed through here earlier. The listener studied the patch more closely. The bend was not deep enough for a heavy creature, but too uniform for random motion. The figure confirmed the observation quietly. They explained that Sun Tzu believed patterns were rarely meaningless. The world constantly recorded movement, intention, and emotion. Those who learned to read these records gained an advantage not through force, but through awareness. The figure's fingers brushed lightly across the grass, emphasizing how even the gentlest touch could redirect understanding. As they continued forward, the hills gradually rose higher, guiding them toward a point where the meadow met a sparse forest of slender trees. Their trunks were pale, their leaves delicate, trembling lightly even in the faintest breeze. The transition from open field to narrow woodland felt symbolic, moving from the broadness of possibility into the intimacy of introspection. Sun Tzu often used landscapes to mirror internal states, and the listener felt that shift instinctively. Within the woodland, the light softened, filtering through the canopy in gentle, scattered patterns. Shadows wove themselves between the trees, creating a shifting tapestry on the forest floor. The figure moved with unbroken ease, their footsteps barely making a sound. They spoke of how Sun Tzu understood movement not as force, but as harmony, every action chosen with consideration of environment, timing, and emotion. They explained how battles were not truly won by strength, but by the ability to sense the moment when action mattered and the moment when restraint carried more power. A faint sound, somewhere between a whisper and a sigh, rose from deeper within the forest. It was not threatening, merely present, like the world acknowledging their arrival. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above to form a subtle arch that guided them inward. The ground here was soft with layers of fallen leaves, muffling each step into near silence. The figure slowed, then stopped entirely as they reached a small clearing at the heart of the trees. At its center lay a stone basin carved from a single boulder, filled with clear water that reflected the canopy above in a shimmering mosaic. The basin appeared untouched by human hands for years, yet the water remained remarkably clean, as though fed by a hidden spring. The figure approached it with a reverence that suggested it held significance beyond its appearance. They explained that Sun Tzu often regarded still water as the purest metaphor for the mind, a surface that reflects truth only when undisturbed. Turmoil creates distortion. Fear creates ripples. Impulse shatters clarity. But when the mind becomes still, when it stops reacting to illusions and expectations, it begins to see the world as it is, not as it is feared to be. The figure invited the listener to kneel beside the basin. The water's surface reflected their face, but not sharply. The shifting leaves above caused ripples of light to play across their features. The listener watched these distortions, understanding instinctively that clarity was not the absence of movement, but the ability to see meaning within it. A faint breeze brushed the surface, sending concentric rings of gentle motion outward. The figure nodded, sensing the listener's recognition. This clearing held a stillness different from the meadow's openness or the cedar grove's quiet. It felt like a pause in the world's breath, a moment deliberately shaped for insight. The figure stood beside the listener in complete silence, neither rushing the moment nor seeking to explain it away. And in that stillness, the listener sensed that the journey had shifted again. The landscape felt like a teacher now, each place revealing a different layer of understanding. A soft pulse of wind passed through the clearing, carrying with it the faintest hint of something stirring beyond the trees. The figure lifted their head slightly, as though noticing a subtle change in the world's rhythm. They turned toward a narrow path leading out of the clearing, time moving gently forward again, guiding the listener toward the next unfolding layer of truth. The path leading away from the stone basin wound between the slender trees in a gentle arc, illuminated by the filtered light that drifted through small openings in the canopy above. The air felt cooler here, touched by moisture rising from the nearby spring, and each breath carried a subtle clarity that sharpened the senses. The faint sound that had stirred the figure's attention earlier grew more defined as they walked, soft footfalls tapping against the earth, mingling with the distant rustle of leaves. It was not hurried or heavy, but present, intentional, like a presence approaching from a parallel rhythm of the forest. The terrain beneath their feet shifted from leaf-covered soil to firmer ground scattered with smooth stones. These stones formed natural patterns, some arranged by the flow of rainwater, others seemingly scattered by passing animals. The figure paused at a cluster of them, studying their arrangement with a focused calm. They knelt and lifted one stone, feeling its weight and inspecting its underside before placing it gently back in place. Sun Tzu often spoke of environments as silent advisors, offering direction through the way they held their form. A stone turned out of alignment meant something had passed. A stone untouched meant something had avoided the area. Even the smallest detail was information. As they moved deeper into the woodland, the trees began to thin, allowing broader beams of light to spill across the forest floor. The narrow path opened gradually into an area where younger trees grew in scattered clusters, their branches reaching upward with a kind of eager innocence. The air warmed slightly and the sound of the forest shifted. Chirps of insects became more distinct, the rustle of small creatures more frequent. This part of the forest felt vibrant, alive with subtle movements that spoke of constant adaptation. Ahead, a small rise in the land formed a gentle slope leading to a rocky platform. The figure stepped onto the platform with deliberate ease, motioning for the listener to join. From this vantage, the forest spread outward in visible patterns, areas of dense growth, patches of open space, narrow corridors shaped by years of wind and animal travel. The figure pointed toward these patterns, explaining how Sun Tzu believed that environments revealed more than obstacles. They revealed opportunity. Every cluster of trees suggested shelter. Every stretch of open ground suggested exposure. Strategy was not about imposing one's will on the land but understanding how the land already shaped the situation. As the figure spoke, the faint sound of approaching footsteps grew clearer, not threatening but steady. The listener turned as a deer emerged from behind a cluster of bushes. Its form was elegant, its movements deliberate, its gaze sharp with quiet instinct. It paused at the edge of the rocky platform, observing them with the calm alertness of a creature deeply attuned to its surroundings. The deer's presence brought a natural pause to the moment. The forest held its breath again. The deer stepped lightly across the clearing, weaving through the trees with fluid grace. Its movements revealed another aspect of Sun Tzu's teachings, the art of moving with rather than against the world. The deer did not dominate the forest. It harmonized with it, choosing paths shaped by instinct, memory, and the quiet understanding of danger and safety. It moved until it reached a patch of grass bathed in sunlight, lowered its head to graze, then lifted it again in a single, smooth motion. The figure observed the animal with a thoughtful expression, then turned to the listener. They explained that Sun Tzu believed strength did not lie in aggression but in awareness. The deer survived not because it fought harder, but because it read the world with precision. It sensed movement before it arrived. It recognized patterns before they formed. It acted in alignment with the forest's rhythms. A sudden breeze stirred the trees, shifting the light and causing the deer's ears to flick in quick response. It looked toward the deeper forest, sensing something the listener could not yet detect. Sun Tzu often emphasized this distinction. Those who learn the world's language move earlier than those who wait for clarity. The deer's body tensed for a moment before relaxing, the perceived shift passing harmlessly. It then returned to its grazing, unaffected but more aware. The figure stepped down from the rocky platform and continued walking, guiding the listener toward a path that curved gently around a fallen log covered in moss. The forest here grew denser again, the light thinning into narrow beams that highlighted patches of fern and clusters of budding leaves. The path narrowed, requiring them to move with more intention, placing each foot carefully to avoid branches that jutted from the ground at awkward angles. As they reached a bend in the path, the forest opened suddenly into a natural amphitheater, a circle of trees surrounding a shallow depression in the earth. Sunlight filtered through in a geometric pattern, creating alternating bands of light and shadow across the ground. The figure stepped into the center of this space and stood still, allowing the atmosphere to settle around them. They spoke quietly, explaining that Sun Tzu believed the world often created moments designed for reflection, natural pauses where movement gave way to comprehension. This amphitheater felt like one of those moments. The air was balanced, neither too still nor too active. The sounds of the forest were present but muted. The light drew gentle shapes across the ground, emphasizing the symmetry of the space. The listener stepped beside the figure, feeling the weight of the surroundings settle into their awareness. The air carried a faint charge, not tension but anticipation, as though the forest were preparing to reveal something deeper. The figure's gaze shifted toward a narrow opening on the opposite side of the amphitheater, where the trees parted enough to let a sliver of light fall in a straight line across the ground. They nodded slowly, sensing the direction the world was pointing them toward. And in that shared silence, the listener understood. The path was not leading them somewhere new. It was leading them inward, toward a layer of understanding Sun Tzu reserved for those who learn to see without forcing meaning. The narrow opening beyond the amphitheater led into a stretch of woodland where the trees grew taller and the canopy thickened into a vaulted ceiling of interlaced branches. The air shifted noticeably as the listener stepped into this deeper grove, cooler, quieter, touched by the scent of damp bark and fallen leaves decomposing gently into the forest floor. Sunlight filtered through in thin, trembling slices, creating delicate patterns that drifted across the path as the breeze passed through the upper branches. The figure moved ahead with a calm, steady pace, their footsteps softened by the thick layer of moss that blanketed the ground like an ancient carpet woven by time. They explained softly as they walked that Sun Tzu often regarded places like this as the emotional landscape of the mind, the parts rarely visited, where old thoughts settle into the subconscious like sediment. People avoid such inner forests because the quiet feels too honest. But clarity demands that one learns to walk through these shaded regions without fear. The listener felt the weight of this truth as the grove wrapped around them in ambient stillness. A faint glimmer caught their eye, dew droplets clinging to delicate spider silk strung between two low branches. The threads vibrated subtly in the breeze, catching slivers of light like tiny, trembling stars. The figure paused, observing the web with a thoughtful calm. They explained how Sun Tzu admired the spider, not for its predation but for its patience. The web is spun quietly, carefully, without urgency. Strength lies not in the trap, but in the awareness of subtle movement, the slightest tremor alerting the spider long before the prey understands it has been seen. Awareness precedes action. In strategy and in life, Sun Tzu taught that this order must never be reversed. A crackling sound echoed faintly in the distance, the rustle of something moving through brush, purposeful yet unhurried. The listener paused, instinctively listening. The sound came again, then faded. The figure lifted their gaze, sensing direction not through sight but through the texture of sound itself. They explained that in places of quiet, even the smallest noise reveals intent. Loud movement often signals carelessness. Soft, consistent movement signals purpose. The listener held on to this lesson as they continued walking. The path guided them deeper until the trees suddenly parted, revealing a small valley hidden within the forest's heart. Sunlight spilled freely into this place, illuminating patches of grass that waved gently in the midday breeze. A clear pool lay at the center, fed by a narrow trickle of water running down from a rocky ledge. The pool's surface shimmered with a luminous clarity, reflecting the sky in a near-perfect mirror. The figure stepped toward it, their posture shifting, a subtle blend of reverence and recognition, as though this hidden space embodied something essential. They knelt at the pool's edge and touched the water lightly. The ripples moved outward in slow concentric rings, distorting the mirror-like surface into delicate arcs. Sun Tzu often used water as the ultimate metaphor for strategy, yielding yet unstoppable, adaptive yet unwavering in direction. The figure invited the listener to kneel and watch how their reflection changed with each ripple. The face seen in perfectly still water differed from the face seen in movement. Identity itself depended on the state of the mind reflecting it. Turbulence creates distortion. Stillness restores truth. The listener remained quiet as the ripples settled again, revealing their reflection with newfound clarity. The figure spoke softly, explaining that Sun Tzu believed self-knowledge formed the foundation of every victory. Without it, even the most brilliant strategy collapses. Most people fight external battles while remaining strangers to themselves. They chase control over the world but lose control over their own thoughts. Strategy begins with internal mastery, long before it manifests in any outward action. A soft wind swept across the valley, causing the surface of the pool to ripple once more, but this time the distortion felt gentle, almost soothing. The breeze carried the scent of mountain herbs and distant stone, grounding the listener in the present. A bird darted overhead, its shadow breaking briefly across the pool before disappearing into the trees. The figure watched it go, then rose from their kneeling position, motioning for the listener to join them as they moved toward the far edge of the hidden valley. There, the ground shifted again, from soft grass to rougher terrain shaped by scattered stones. The trees thinned further until they reached the base of a sloping hillside. A narrow trail carved into the rock wound upward, its incline steep but navigable. The figure began the ascent without hesitation, their steps measured, their breathing steady. The listener followed, feeling the texture of the path change beneath their feet with each upward shift. As they climbed, the forest thinned until open sky stretched wide above them. The air grew crisper, filled with the faint scent of mineral-rich stone warmed by the sun. The hillside offered a view of the forest below, dense, layered, a tapestry of light and shadow. The figure paused halfway up the slope, gazing across the expanse. They spoke of Sun Tzu's teaching on elevation. That perspective changes the meaning of every situation. What once seemed threatening can appear small. What once seemed tangled can reveal its structure. What once felt overwhelming can become manageable. Near the top of the hill, the wind strengthened, tugging at their clothing and carrying the faint sound of something vast beyond the ridge. Not loud, more like the distant presence of space. The listener sensed the same pull, the same subtle invitation to reach the crest. The figure continued the climb, the rhythm of their footsteps anchoring the listener's resolve. Finally they reached the top. The hillside opened into a wide ridge that overlooked an even larger valley beyond. A valley deeper, broader, filled with rolling fields and shifting shadows cast by distant mountains. The expanse felt different from all the landscapes before it, bigger, quieter, almost solemn. The figure stood still for a long moment, letting the silence speak first. Then they said that Sun Tzu believed clarity leads inevitably to a threshold, a point where understanding widens into something larger than thought. The listener stood beside them, feeling the truth of that threshold in the vastness below. The ridge held the moment gently. And the path ahead waited with a quiet gravity, ready for the next unfolding layer. The ridge stretched long beneath the open sky, its stone surface warm beneath the midday light. Wind swept across it in steady currents, carrying with it the scent of distant grasses and the faint mineral tang of mountain rock. The listener stood beside the figure, gazing over the immense valley that opened before them, a landscape shaped by time, its contours rolling outward until they merged with the silhouettes of far-off peaks. The sheer scale of the view brought a subtle weight to the chest, a reminder of how small a single step could feel when set against the vast architecture of the world. The figure remained silent at first, allowing the listener to absorb the immensity. Sun Tzu often taught that true understanding required moments of spaciousness, where the mind could expand beyond the confines of immediate thought. The wind moved through the listener's hair, brushing gently across their skin, carrying a softness that contrasted with the valley's imposing breadth. The figure finally spoke, their voice low, explaining that this wide perspective mirrored the extended vision a strategist must cultivate. Seeing the whole landscape, literal or internal, allows choices to be made with precision rather than haste. They began walking along the ridge, their footsteps sending soft echoes down the slope. The path here was uneven, shaped by erosion and time, but it held a subtle rhythm that guided their pace. Small stones shifted underfoot, and clusters of hardy shrubs clung to cracks in the rock, their leaves trembling in the breeze. The figure touched one of these shrubs gently, noting its resilience. Sun Tzu believed that strength was not always loud. Often, it appeared in the quiet persistence of those who adapted to harsh terrain. The shrub thrived not in spite of the ridge, but because it learned to draw life from it. As they continued, the ridge narrowed into a natural bridge of stone connecting two larger outcroppings. The valley on either side dropped steeply, filled with deep brush and scattered boulders. The air grew sharper here, the wind more insistent. The figure moved with unwavering steadiness, each step deliberate, each shift of weight chosen with care. They explained that Sun Tzu warned of such terrain, places where rash movement could lead to collapse and where hesitation could reveal fear. In these moments, the mind must steady itself before the body moves. Confidence is not speed, it is the ability to place one's foot where the world will hold it. When they reached the broader outcropping on the far side, the ridge widened again, offering space to breathe. Here, the wind softened, brushing lightly over patches of dry grass that clung to the stone. The figure paused and looked toward a distant point in the valley where a faint trail wound between hills. They spoke of how battles, literal or metaphorical, are not defined by confrontation alone but by the invisible lines of movement that lead to them. Every choice is a direction taken. Every hesitation is a direction avoided. Over time, these subtle paths shape the outcome far more than the final clash. The listener felt the weight of this insight settle into their awareness. Their gaze drifted along the valley floor, following the faint trail shaped by travelers whose footsteps had long since faded. The figure noted that Sun Tzu believed the best strategists read not the present moment alone, but the remnants of the past embedded in the land. People leave traces, footprints, decisions, unintended consequences, that shape the environment for those who follow. A shift in the wind brought the distant cry of an eagle soaring above the mountains. Its shadow swept across the ridge, momentarily darkening the stone beneath them. The figure watched the bird with calm admiration, pointing out how it moved with the currents instead of struggling against them. Its wings stretched wide, allowing the wind to carry it upward effortlessly. Sun Tzu admired this efficiency, the art of using the environment to magnify one's own motion. The listener felt the lesson resonate deeply, the power that comes not from resistance but from alignment. As the eagle rose higher, its cry echoed across the valley, fading slowly into the distance. The figure turned back toward the path, guiding the listener further along the ridge. The terrain shifted once more, sloping downward into a gentler incline covered with patches of grass, scattered stones, and small clusters of wild herbs. The scent of sage and mountain mint drifted upward, carried by the breeze. The air here felt warmer, more inviting. They descended the slope, moving toward a sheltered hollow nestled between two large rock formations. The hollow held a quiet atmosphere, as though shielded from the wind and shaped by the slow passage of time. The ground was softer here, covered in a thin layer of soil enriched by rain that gathered in this natural bowl. A few saplings had taken root, their branches reaching upward in determined arcs. The figure stepped into the hollow and knelt beside one of the saplings, brushing soil lightly away from its base. They spoke of cultivation, how Sun Tzu believed the strongest leaders were those who nurtured their strengths slowly, consistently, rather than forcing rapid change. A tree grown too quickly often lacks resilient roots. The listener absorbed this quietly, sensing the metaphor not as advice but as lived truth embedded in the land. A faint echo rolled from the deeper valley beyond, a distant shift of wind or the movement of some unseen animal. The figure lifted their head, sensing the moment as Sun Tzu once described it, the whisper before new insight forms. They rose from the sapling, their posture aligning with a new direction. The hollow felt like a pause, an inhalation, before the path ahead began to lean gently toward something more profound. The figure turned toward a narrow passage leading away from the hollow, carved naturally between two rising stone walls. And with that quiet shift of direction, the valley seemed to awaken again, guiding them toward the next deepening layer of understanding. The passage between the stone walls narrowed as the listener stepped into it, the air shifting in temperature the moment the valley's openness fell away behind them. Here the world felt compressed, not suffocating but intentional, like a hand guiding them gently into a space where distractions dissolved. The stone walls rose on either side in rough, uneven formations, streaked with mineral veins that glimmered faintly in the filtered light. Shadows lingered in the crevices, soft but deep enough to create an atmosphere of introspection. The figure ahead moved with a quiet precision, their steps slow and steady, acknowledging the shift without resistance. The air carried a faint echo as though each footfall returned in softened form. The listener noticed how the ground here was smoother, worn down by countless years of wind and rain that had carved the passage naturally. The figure brushed their hand along one wall as they walked, noting how Sun Tzu believed that environments shaped by time rather than force held lessons more honest than any crafted by human hands. Time carves slowly but leaves results that endure. People who learn to move with patience rather than urgency cultivate strategies that last beyond impulse. Near the midpoint of the passage, the walls drew closer together until the listener could touch both sides with outstretched hands. The limited space amplified each breath, each shift in posture, each exhale. The figure paused, turning slightly to ensure the listener felt the weight of this narrowing. They explained that Sun Tzu often spoke of compression, not as an obstacle but as a clarifier. When space is limited, priorities sharpen. Noise fades. The mind cannot wander. Movement becomes deliberate. Compression reveals what truly matters. A faint trickle of water echoed ahead, guiding them deeper into the passage. The sound grew clearer with each step until a thin stream appeared at the base of the right wall, flowing along a smooth channel carved by water over centuries. The trickle's rhythm carried a delicate insistence, reinforcing Sun Tzu's principle of persistence. Water rarely overwhelms by force. It transforms landscapes through steady, patient momentum. The figure knelt beside the trickle, dipping their fingers into it. They lifted their hand and let the droplets fall slowly, watching how they scattered across the stone, each droplet following its own path until merging again with the flow. Emerging from the narrowest point, the passage widened abruptly into an open alcove bathed in warm light. The shift felt almost ceremonial, like stepping from constraint into sudden possibility. The alcove opened skyward, framed by steep stone walls that formed a natural amphitheater. Sunlight poured directly into the center, creating a circular patch of golden light on the ground. Moss grew thick along the walls, bright green and lush where the sun reached it, fading into darker shades where shadows prevailed. The contrast created a gradient of life, vibrant at the top, muted but persistent at the base. The figure stepped into the center of the alcove, allowing the light to fall fully across their shoulders. They gestured for the listener to stand beside them, explaining that Sun Tzu valued spaces like this because they revealed the interplay between exposure and protection. Here, one was open to the sky, visible from above, yet shielded from all sides by the rising stone. Vulnerability and safety coexisted. In life and in conflict, understanding this duality makes the difference between reckless action and deliberate strength. The wind swirled gently within the alcove, moving in a circular pattern shaped by the curved walls. Loose leaves traced small spirals in the air before settling gently at the edges. The figure lifted one leaf, holding it flat on their palm. They spoke of how Sun Tzu believed that environments responded to the movements within them. A single step changes the air. A single choice changes direction. Even stillness creates influence. The leaf trembled slightly in the shifting air, mirroring how subtle shifts in intention alter outcomes long before action is taken. A faint rumble rippled through the ground, a distant movement, perhaps a falling rock or the shifting weight of unseen terrain. It was soft but noticeable enough to draw attention. The figure listened carefully, closing their eyes briefly, feeling the vibration rather than merely hearing it. They explained that Sun Tzu taught the importance of sensing movement before it becomes visible. Many conflicts are decided not in the moment of impact, but in the quiet rumblings that precede it. Those who learn to feel the ground's subtle shifts, physical or emotional, gain insight others dismiss. The alcove narrowed again on its far side, where a sloping trail climbed upward in a spiral form. The figure began ascending the path, their steps anchored but unhurried. As the listener followed, the vantage shifted with each turn, revealing different portions of the valley below and the forest behind. The elevation offered glimpses of places they had walked earlier, the cedar corridor, the meadow, the hidden pool, now appearing small, connected threads in a larger tapestry. Sun Tzu taught that reviewing one's path from a height reveals meaning that cannot be sensed from the ground. The figure paused at one ledge where the view aligned perfectly, showing the trail's subtle design, how each landscape led naturally to the next, without force or abrupt transition. The listener recognized the pattern with growing clarity. Each environment had revealed a different layer of understanding. The valley shaped awareness. The forest shaped attention. The ridge shaped perspective. And now this ascent shaped continuity. At the spiral's peak, they emerged onto a high platform of weathered stone overlooking a vast expanse. The wind hit stronger here, brushing across the listener's face with a crispness that smelled of distance. Mountains, open plains, unknown terrain beyond what sight could reach. The figure stood tall, their posture aligned with the wind. They said that Sun Tzu believed every journey carries a point where the path no longer teaches through detail, but through vastness, inviting the mind to recognize its place within something larger than comprehension. The platform held that vastness like a quiet truth. And beyond its edge, a broader movement waited, shaped by the unfolding horizon. The platform at the summit stretched wide beneath the open sky, its surface uneven with age, carved by centuries of wind and rain. The air here was clearer, thinner, carrying a sharpness that sharpened the senses. The listener stood beside the figure, looking out over a landscape so expansive it felt almost unreal. Rolling plains stretching to the limits of sight, forests forming dark patches in the distance, rivers glinting like silver lines drifting across the earth. Mountains formed a jagged crown along the horizon, their peaks shrouded in faint veils of mist. The wind pressed steadily against them, strong but not harsh, like a reminder of the world's untamed presence. The figure allowed the breeze to sweep across their clothing without resistance, their posture soft but grounded. They explained that Sun Tzu believed high places revealed truths obscured on the ground, not because elevation created wisdom, but because it offered perspective free from the clutter of detail. From here, the world appeared not as a series of disconnected events, but as a unified terrain shaped by movement, time, and cause. They began walking along the edge of the platform, where the stone fell away in steep cliffs that dropped into deep valleys below. The descent appeared sudden and unforgiving, but the figure's steps stayed measured. They touched the stone surface lightly with one hand, feeling its texture. Rough patches where erosion had carved deeper grooves, smoother areas where the wind had polished the rock through repeated touch. They noted that Sun Tzu taught leaders to feel the terrain, not just see it. Sight reveals shape, touch reveals story. A lone hawk soared overhead, carried by thermal winds rising from the rock below. Its wings stretched wide, gliding with effortless grace across the endless expanse. The figure watched its motion carefully, pointing out how the hawk shifted direction without obvious force, adjusting its feathers, tilting its wings, using the world rather than fighting it. Sun Tzu admired creatures that understood the rhythm of their environment. Those who expend unnecessary effort exhaust themselves long before the task is done. Those who move with the world conserve strength for the moments that matter. The hawk dipped suddenly, then rose again with a smooth, intentional curve. The figure explained that this movement reflected one of Sun Tzu's deeper lessons, that retreat and advance are not opposites, but complementary strategies. At times one must yield to rise higher. At times one must withdraw to gain clarity. Wisdom lies not in constant forward motion, but in understanding when each direction serves the greater purpose. As they continued along the platform, the stone path revealed fractures, thin lines etched into the rock like veins of an ancient body. Some cracks were shallow, others burrowed deeply into the surface, hinting at instability beneath. The figure paused to study one particularly deep fissure, crouching to examine the way it split into branching routes. They ran their fingers along the stone, noting how fractures reveal history. Stress leaves patterns. So do conflict, hesitation, fear, and pressure. Sun Tzu taught that a wise strategist learns to read these fractures in people as well as in terrain. Where a person breaks reveals more than where they stand strong. A distant rumble rose from far below, not loud enough to startle but deep enough to vibrate through the stone. The listener felt it resonate through their feet, a low hum that lingered even after the sound faded. The figure stood still, eyes half closed, absorbing the tremor. They spoke softly of how Sun Tzu emphasized the importance of sensing what lies beneath surfaces. Noise often distracts, silence often reveals. A tremor can signify movement, transformation, or warning. Those who ignore subtle changes find themselves unprepared when shifts become unavoidable. They approached the far end of the platform, where a narrow stone ridge extended outward like a natural bridge. Below it, the valley sloped into a labyrinth of canyons shaped by forgotten rivers. The wind intensified here, carrying the rich scent of minerals and distant rain. Clouds gathered along the horizon, thin at first, then gradually thickening, forming long streaks of gray and white that drifted like ancient brushstrokes across the sky. The figure watched the clouds for a long moment, their expression composed but alert. They explained that Sun Tzu saw in weather the perfect metaphor for timing. Clouds build long before rain falls. Tension rises long before conflict begins. Pressure forms in silence. Those who wait only for the storm's arrival are always too late. Wisdom lies in recognizing beginnings before others do, reading the sky not for what is obvious, but for what will soon unfold. The figure turned to the listener with a calm, clear gaze that carried the weight of what lay ahead. They motioned toward a descending trail carved along the cliff's edge, barely visible but present. The path wound downward in a series of narrow steps that disappeared behind a curve of stone. It led not back into the forest they came from, but toward new terrain, deeper and more complex than what the journey had revealed so far. The listener felt a pull, not urgency but inevitability. Sun Tzu's teachings had carried them through landscapes of clarity, reflection, and height. Now, the valley ahead seemed to promise not knowledge alone, but transformation. The figure stepped toward the path. And the world, vast and waiting, breathed inward, inviting the next descent into deeper understanding. The path carved along the cliff's edge descended in a narrow series of turns, its stone steps worn smooth by countless years of weather and the rare footsteps of those who dared to follow it. As the listener began the descent behind the figure, the wind rose and fell with rhythmic intensity, brushing along the cliff face and carrying with it traces of rain gathering somewhere far beyond sight. The air shifted with each step, becoming cooler, more textured, as though each movement brought them deeper into a space shaped by unseen forces. The stone walls on either side grew closer at certain points, then widened abruptly to reveal small ledges overlooking the canyon below. Shadows pooled within the crevices, contrasting sharply with the light that spilled across the upper ridges. The descent carried a subtle unease, not danger but the awareness of depth, the sense of stepping into a part of the world rarely touched by casual travelers. The figure descended without hesitation, their movements steady and grounded, embodying Sun Tzu's belief that confidence comes from understanding, not from dismissing fear. A narrow gust cut across the path, pushing loose dust into the air. The particles danced briefly in the sunlight before settling again. The figure paused and placed a hand against the rock, sensing the wind's direction. They explained quietly that Sun Tzu often spoke of winds as messengers, subtle indicators of shifts in environment or emotion. Strong winds warn of change. Gentle winds whisper of opportunity. Intermittent winds suggest conflict between forces unseen. To understand movement, one must learn to read not only visible motion, but the invisible pressure that shapes it. As they continued downward, the canyon walls revealed ancient layers of stone, each stratum carrying a different shade, deep rust, pale gray, muted ochre. These layers formed a geological memory, a silent record of transformation stretching back long before humans sought understanding within such places. The listener traced the lines with their eyes, recognizing how Sun Tzu regarded history not as a sequence of events, but as a landscape of patterns. The world leaves traces for those who learn to see them. The path eventually opened into a wide shelf of rock jutting outward over a deeper section of the canyon. The shelf formed a natural landing where the wind slowed and the air settled into a heavy stillness. From this point, the canyon revealed its labyrinthine structure. Narrow channels weaving between towering walls, pockets of shadow hiding unknown depths, and occasional bursts of sunlight catching on mineral surfaces. The view felt ancient, almost ceremonial, as though the canyon had been shaped deliberately to hold the weight of silence. The figure approached the edge of the shelf and knelt, placing a hand against the stone. They spoke of Sun Tzu's teaching that the most difficult terrain often teaches the most profound lessons. Canyons symbolize descent into the hidden regions of the mind, the places where fear, memory, and instinct intertwine. To navigate such terrain requires more than strategy, it requires honesty with oneself. A person who denies their own depth becomes lost in the first unexpected turn. A person who acknowledges it learns to find paths even where none appear visible. A faint echo rose from somewhere within the canyon, soft, irregular, shaped by the shifting air. The sound lacked a clear source, resonating instead like an impression carried along stone corridors. The figure listened carefully, tilting their head slightly. They explained that Sun Tzu believed echoes reveal structure. The shape of a response, its depth, duration, and direction, uncovers the shape of the environment long before sight does. In strategy, this principle holds: reactions reveal truth even when words do not. They left the shelf behind and descended further, following a narrower path that wound into the canyon's inner space. Here, the light dimmed, filtered through the overhanging cliffs in pale, fragmented beams. The air thickened with earthy scents, damp stone, moss hidden in crevices, and the faint metallic aroma of minerals exposed through erosion. Each breath felt heavier, grounding the listener in the reality of where they stood. The canyon floor rose suddenly before them, forming a natural terrace covered with patches of fine sand. Footprints, some fresh, others softened by wind, crisscrossed the surface. The figure crouched to examine them, running their fingers along the indentations. The more recent prints were shallow, indicating someone who moved lightly. Older ones were deeper, formed by someone carrying weight or tension. Sun Tzu taught that footprints reveal not only direction, but the emotion carried by those who left them. A hurried step speaks differently from a deliberate one. The sand held these stories gently, waiting for those who could read them. Beyond the terrace, a narrow corridor led into a chamber partially open to the sky. Light spilled through a long slit in the rock overhead, illuminating the space in a narrow line that cut across the floor like a blade of sunlight. The figure stepped into the chamber, their silhouette outlined by the glow. The chamber's walls were smooth in some places, jagged in others, creating an interplay of shadow and illumination that felt almost symbolic. The figure touched the wall where the jagged stone met the smooth surface. They explained that Sun Tzu understood conflict in the same way, rarely uniform, rarely predictable. It contains sharp edges and soft spaces, sudden angles and steady planes. To navigate conflict effectively, one must feel each shift without flinching, recognizing that imbalance does not mean defeat. It means understanding must deepen. The chamber's silence deepened into something palpable, as though the canyon held its breath. The figure turned toward a dark opening at the far end of the chamber. A faint draft flowed from it, cool, steady, carrying the scent of deeper stone. They motioned for the listener to follow, explaining that Sun Tzu believed true clarity emerges only when one is willing to step into regions of uncertainty. Avoiding darkness prevents discovery. Entering it with awareness reveals what others fear to see. Together, they stepped toward the shadowed passage where the canyon's depths waited, quiet and unshaken, ready to reveal another layer of hidden truth. The passage beyond the chamber narrowed into a low corridor carved not by human hands but by centuries of water shaping the stone into smooth, flowing curves. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying a dampness that clung to the skin. The faint sound of dripping water echoed softly in the distance, creating a slow, rhythmic pulse that resonated through the enclosed space. The walls glimmered faintly with moisture, catching small fragments of light that filtered in from the chamber behind them. The listener felt their breath steady as they moved deeper, the darkness ahead no longer threatening, but inviting, like a space that held truth patiently rather than hiding it. The figure walked with unwavering calm, their silhouette outlined against the faint glow behind them. They placed a hand against the wall occasionally, feeling its texture, the smooth curves where water once flowed, the subtle indentations where erosion shifted the stone's form. They explained that Sun Tzu believed environments shaped by water teach the most profound lessons, because water moves with purpose yet without force. It does not demand, it adapts. It does not dominate, it persists. Its path is shaped by patience, and its influence endures long after its movement ceases. As the corridor deepened, the faint pulse of dripping water grew louder, guiding them forward like a distant heartbeat. The passage widened suddenly into a cavern filled with cool, shadowed air. The cavern ceiling arched high above them, streaked with mineral lines that glimmered faintly when touched by the scant light that slipped through cracks above. Pools of still water formed at the cavern's edges, reflecting the stone ceiling in quiet, trembling reflections. The sound of dripping water echoed softly across the cavern, each drop creating expanding ripples that dissolved into the stillness. The figure approached one of the pools and knelt, dipping their fingers into the surface. The water was cold, almost startlingly so. They lifted their hand, watching droplets fall back into the pool. They spoke of Sun Tzu's teaching that stillness contains depth. Beneath quiet surfaces lie unseen currents, thoughts not yet realized, emotions not yet acknowledged, patterns not yet understood. People fear stillness because it forces them to confront themselves. But stillness is where truth gathers. The listener felt the weight of this as the cavern's quiet pressed gently around them. A faint tremor resonated through the cavern floor, soft, brief, but enough to shift a small pebble near the pool's edge. The sound carried through the hollow space, echoing in diminishing waves. The figure rose slowly, listening to the echo's pattern. They explained that Sun Tzu believed small shifts often predict larger movements. A tremor can precede collapse. A whisper can precede conflict. A hesitation can precede transformation. Those who learn to sense these early signals gain an advantage that feels almost like foresight. They continued through the cavern, their footsteps softened by the sand that lined certain sections of the floor. The cavern narrowed again, leading into a tall passage where faint beams of light filtered through cracks in the rock above. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, creating visible currents that revealed the airflow within the space. The figure paused to watch their movement, explaining how Sun Tzu valued such subtle indicators. Airflow reveals hidden openings. Dust reveals movement where none is visible. Light reveals weakness in stone. The world communicates constantly, but most people never learn its language. At the end of the tall passage, the stone opened into a narrow balcony carved naturally into the canyon wall. The balcony overlooked a deep chasm, its depths cloaked in shadow. A soft wind rose from below, carrying with it the earthy scent of stone warmed by time. The figure stood at the edge, their gaze steady. They explained that Sun Tzu understood chasms as the representation of inner divides, places where clarity meets doubt, where confidence meets fear. Crossing such divides requires neither blind courage nor reckless impulse. It requires awareness, the understanding of one's footing, and the willingness to move despite uncertainty. A thin path extended from the balcony, bridging the chasm with a narrow strip of rock formed naturally by erosion long ago. It was not dangerous, but it demanded presence. The figure stepped onto it with calm certainty, each movement aligned with the subtle shifts of the wind. The listener followed, placing each foot carefully, feeling the stone's firmness beneath them. As they crossed the bridge, a flock of small birds burst from a crevice in the cliff, scattering into the sky with swift, synchronized motion. Their sudden flight echoed Sun Tzu's teaching. Movement is often triggered not by force, but by the quiet recognition of change. On the far side, the path widened again, leading into an elevated terrace where sunlight filtered through a long vertical crack in the cliff. The light stretched across the stone like a golden ribbon, illuminating fine dust, dried leaves, and faint markings etched into the ground. The figure knelt to examine the markings, shallow grooves and circular impressions, traces left by someone who once paused here. Their gestures were deliberate, contemplative. They explained that Sun Tzu believed traces of past movement reveal not only direction but purpose. These markings suggested someone had rested here, gathering strength before continuing deeper into the canyon. The listener touched one of the grooves, feeling its subtle indentation. It felt faint, fragile, yet meaningful, the kind of trace that might disappear in a single storm, yet had survived long enough to be read. The figure rose, their posture steady, and turned toward a narrow ascent carved naturally into the stone. The stairs were uneven, shaped by erosion, leading upward toward a space where the stone glowed faintly with reflected light. The wind shifted again, carrying a warmth that suggested they were nearing another threshold, one shaped not by descent but by emergence. The figure began the climb, and the canyon's depth receded behind them. Ahead, the path leaned toward light, toward clarity, toward the next awakening of Sun Tzu's quiet truth. The ascent curved upward through the stone in a narrow, spiraling motion, each step revealing more light as the canyon slowly released its hold on the path. The air grew warmer with each stride, touched by the faint scent of sun-heated rock drifting down from above. The walls around them opened gradually, allowing thin shafts of gold to pierce the darkness in gentle intervals. With each rise in elevation, the space felt less confined, less shaped by shadow and echo, and more like an invitation toward clarity, as if the canyon itself recognized the transition from depth to understanding. The figure moved with a relaxed steadiness, their silhouette brightening as sunlight gathered around them. They kept one hand brushing lightly against the stone, as though acknowledging the passage that had carried them thus far. They explained that Sun Tzu believed emergence was as important as descent. One enters depth to learn what the surface cannot reveal, but one must return to the light to understand how to use that knowledge. Reflection without emergence leads to stagnation. Emergence without reflection leads to repetition. The listener absorbed these words as the path widened. Soon the spiral broke open into a high plateau carved naturally into the cliffside. Sunlight poured across the stone in warm waves, illuminating small fractures, patches of dry moss and scattered grains of sand that sparkled faintly. The plateau offered a panoramic view of the upper canyon, its jagged layers glowing in amber and rust, its shadows softening under the noon light. The wind swept across the open space with a refreshing clarity, carrying the fragrance of distant grasslands blending with the faint mineral scent of stone. The figure approached the plateau's edge, where a cluster of flat stones formed what looked almost like a natural place of pause. They knelt beside one of the stones, noting its texture, smooth on one side, rough on the other, shaped by years of shifting weather. They spoke of Sun Tzu's understanding that balance lies not in choosing one texture over another, but in recognizing how smoothness and roughness each serve their purpose. Softness allows adaptation. Firmness provides stability. A mind that learns to shift between both becomes resilient. Across the plateau, a narrow current of air rose from a crack in the stone, carrying with it faint vibrations from the canyon below. The figure closed their eyes and listened, their posture shifting slightly as though aligning with the invisible flow. They explained that Sun Tzu valued such attunement, not mystical but perceptive. Many confuse sensitivity with weakness, but Sun Tzu understood sensitivity as intelligence. Those who sense shifts in the environment before they manifest gain a quiet advantage that requires no force to maintain. A faint movement caught the listener's attention near the plateau's far side, a thin trail of dust rising from behind a boulder. A moment later, a fox emerged, trotting with light, agile steps. Its coat was a muted blend of red and gray that blended seamlessly with the stone and soil. It paused upon noticing the two figures, eyes bright and alert. Then, without anxiety, it turned its head toward a section of the plateau where the wind gathered more strongly. It waited, sensing something in the air that was not yet visible. The figure observed the fox carefully, admiring its clarity. Animals, Sun Tzu believed, reveal truths humans often overlook. Instinct, when unclouded, responds to reality as it is. The fox lifted its head slightly, sniffed the wind, then continued on its path, weaving between stones before disappearing behind a ridge. Its departure left behind a faint, lingering silence, an unspoken reminder that awareness does not need explanation to be valid. The figure turned to the listener, their voice quiet but grounded. They explained that Sun Tzu placed great value on the moments between motion, the pauses that reveal intent before action is taken. They said conflict is rarely decided in the clash, but in the choices leading to the clash. Those who understand these pauses see the world with clearer eyes. Those who do not are led by momentum rather than wisdom. They stepped toward the far end of the plateau, where a narrow stone bridge connected it to the next rise, a ridge bathed in warm, full sunlight. The bridge was wide enough for two people to walk comfortably, but it carried a subtle gravity, as though crossing it required inward focus rather than physical balance. Below it, the canyon stretched deep and silent, layers of stone fading into shadow. The wind slowed as they approached the center, offering a moment of calm suspended between two expanses. When they reached the ridge on the other side, the terrain changed dramatically. Grass replaced stone, spreading in long waves that shimmered under the sun. The air warmed further, infused with the scent of wild herbs that grew along the ridge's crest. The world felt suddenly open again, vast, bright, unconstrained. This transition carried weight, like stepping from contemplation into the beginning of realization. Ahead, the ridge sloped gently into a wide plain. The plain stretched far into the distance, its surface shifting in subtle gradients of gold and green. A soft haze hovered over its edges, blending land and sky into a single, expansive horizon. The figure stood quietly at the ridge's edge, letting the view settle between them. They explained that Sun Tzu believed every journey reaches a point where understanding expands beyond detail and becomes something lived, something that shapes the way one walks through the world. The wind moved across the plain in a slow, sweeping rhythm that brushed through the grasses like an unseen hand. Each wave of movement revealed patterns beneath the surface. Slight dips, hidden paths, subtle ridges formed by years of wind flow. Sun Tzu taught that such patterns exist in every aspect of life. In people, in decisions, in opportunities, in the shifts of emotion. Those who learn to see these patterns gain a form of vision that feels almost intuitive. As the wind settled again, a deep quiet filled the ridge. The figure exhaled gently, their posture softening as though acknowledging the transition. They turned to the listener with calm certainty in their gaze, not as a guide leading a student, but as someone recognizing readiness. Without a word, they began walking down the slope toward the plain, and the land welcomed them with a vast, open breath. The final understanding waited there. Not hidden, not forced. but unfolding with the same quiet inevitability as dawn rising over distant hills. The slope carried them gradually into the open plain, where the world stretched so widely that distance itself seemed to breathe. Grasses stirred in slow, sweeping motions as the wind flowed across the land, creating long, rippling currents that moved like silent tides. The air warmed as they descended, filled with a subtle mixture of sunlit soil and distant blooms, grounding the moment with a calm, expansive clarity. Each step settled into the earth with gentle weight, leaving impressions that the breeze softened almost immediately. Sun Tzu's presence felt stronger here, not as a voice or a figure, but as an atmosphere woven through the openness, steady, guiding, and unmistakably alive. The listener felt the plain accept them in the way vast landscapes often do, quietly, without ceremony, yet with an undeniable sense of belonging. The figure walked beside them, their pace unhurried, their posture relaxed in a way that suggested arrival rather than movement. They said nothing at first. The plain itself seemed to speak, through the rhythm of the grasses, the warm drift of air, the soft hum of insects hidden between stalks. In this openness the world felt impossibly honest. With no cliffs to shape echoes and no forest to shape shadows, everything stood revealed. The horizon stretched uninterrupted, a line so distant it dissolved into the sky. The figure paused, letting the listener take in the vastness. They finally spoke, explaining that Sun Tzu believed clarity reaches its truest form in openness, where nothing obscures one's perception except the assumptions carried within. Here, decisions no longer hide behind environment or circumstance. They rise from the self. They continued walking until they reached a small rise in the plain, a gentle hill covered in low grasses and scattered wildflowers. From its crest, the lands below unfolded with breathtaking simplicity. The soft curves of the earth, the shifting textures of wind-blown plants, the subtle glimmer of a distant river catching sunlight. The figure gestured toward this view, saying that Sun Tzu taught leaders to understand not only terrain, but the meaning it reflects. Plains represent possibility, the wide moment after understanding, where choice becomes creation rather than reaction. A quiet stillness filled the air. The clouds overhead drifted slowly, casting soft shadows that passed across the land in drifting shapes. The figure sat upon the hill's crest, and the listener joined beside them. For several breaths neither spoke. The silence felt full, not empty. It held weight, insight, and the steady pulse of something final settling into place. The figure finally turned to the listener. Their voice carried no urgency, only truth softened by compassion. They explained that Sun Tzu's teachings were never meant solely for war or conflict. They were born from the understanding that life itself is movement, sometimes gentle, sometimes turbulent, always shaped by forces larger than thought alone. To navigate such a world, one must learn to see clearly, act deliberately, and remain rooted in oneself even as circumstances shift. They pointed to the plain, where the wind created shifting paths that disappeared as quickly as they formed. They said this is how life moves, patterns forming and dissolving, opportunities appearing and fading, emotions rising and settling. A strategist is not someone who controls these movements, but someone who understands their nature so that their own actions remain guided rather than impulsive. The listener absorbed this quietly, feeling a subtle shift inside, an easing of something that had long been held too tightly. The figure noticed the change, then continued. They said Sun Tzu wanted people to understand that victory is not the triumph over others, but the steady mastery of oneself. To know one's fears without being ruled by them. To recognize one's strengths without becoming blind to limits. To step into the world with presence, rather than drifting through it distracted or reactive. The wind quieted for a moment, the plain holding its breath as though listening. The figure's final words rose softly, carried by the stillness. That the greatest power is not force but clarity. Not domination but understanding. Not winning battles but knowing which battles are worth one's spirit. The listener felt the truth settle deep, steady, undeniable. They sat together a moment longer, letting the world complete the silence between them. Then the figure stood, not as someone who had finished a lesson, but as someone who honored a threshold crossed. They nodded gently toward the horizon, where the land stretched forward in endless possibility. The listener rose, breathing fully. The world felt wider. Their mind felt quieter. And the path ahead, whatever shape it took, felt profoundly their own. The figure began walking back toward the ridge, fading gradually into the warm shimmer of the plain, while the listener remained facing the horizon, the wind brushing lightly across their skin. Not an ending. Not a conclusion. But a beginning shaped by understanding. And the quiet certainty that the journey ahead would be walked with open eyes and steady breath.